Welcome everyone to this webinar, which is co-hosted by us at 3 Keel and with the Walton Family Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about how we can boost the profile of fisheries in discussions around sustainable food systems, and specifically we're going to look at how we can do that by translating between fisheries and regenerative agriculture and some of the similarities that they share. So on the next slide, up top, I want to draw your attention to the report that this webinar is based on. So it's based on research that we at 3 Keel did along with Walton, and the report was launched by the Walton Family Foundation earlier this year. So we'd encourage you to take a look at the report after the webinar to see the full details of what we're talking about, because we'll be giving an overview today. So you can scan the QR code on the slide there, or there's the link on the slide, and I'll also share the link in the chat that you can follow. So on the next slide, we'll start with some introductions. So this is the team for today. I'm Caitlin McCormack. I'm a senior consultant at 3 Keel. I sit in the agriculture and landscapes team, and my colleague Florence Wiggins will also be presenting. She's a consultant in the same team. And we're delighted to be joined today by Teresa Ish, who's the Oceans Initiative Lead at the Walton Family Foundation that commissioned this study. And Teresa will introduce herself and the foundation and the context for the work from their perspective shortly. We also have my colleague Emily Scott, who's going to be heading up our Q&A team. So if you have questions as we go through, please do put those in the Q&A box, and there'll be time at the end for some questions. So on the next slide, just to give you an idea of who we are at 3 Keel, we're a sustainability consultancy and advisory firm. We're headquartered in Oxford in the UK, but increasingly based across the UK. And we work with businesses, NGOs, governments, other stakeholders across our core practice areas, which are agriculture and landscape innovation, climate change, nature conservation and natural resource management, and also sustainable commodity supply chains. And in particular, on the next slide, we specialize in sustainable food systems, and particularly food and farming supply chains. So we support our clients on solutions for sustainable sourcing of agricultural products, and with the implementation of sustainable sourcing policies, including seafood policy implementation. So in the agriculture and landscapes team, where both Flo and I sit, we're particularly experienced in designing and delivering regenerative agricultural frameworks. And then one of the other key ways that 3 Keel works is by facilitating sectoral collaboration, including at the moment we sit as the Secretariat of the Sustainable Seafood Coalition, of which some of you here might be members. So that's us, and Teresa will introduce herself and Walton shortly, as I said. But on the next slide, I'll give you an overview of the structure of the webinar today. So we'll start by setting the scene about why do we need to bring greater visibility to fisheries, the context and the need for this piece of work. Then we'll do a primer on some of the key terms and concepts that we looked at in the research that are bringing visibility to sustainable agriculture, followed by a quick look at the current extent to which those are being translated to fisheries to date. And then we'll get to the heart of the issue really, which is where we outline where there's potential to draw more and stronger parallels between sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries, where there are commonalities, shared objectives and principles, and even similarities between some practices. And to finish up, we'll consider what's next. So why is this important and useful? What should you do with the information you've heard today? And like I said, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please do add your questions to the Q&A box as we go through. So firstly, to get us started setting the scene, just to explain why we need to find ways to raise the profile of sustainable fisheries, and why in particular we're looking to sustainable agriculture for potential solutions. So at this point, I'll pass to Teresa at Walton Family Foundation to introduce herself in the context of this piece of work. Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caitlin. I'm so happy to be joining the 3 Keel team today to share this work. I lead the Oceans Initiative at the Walton Family Foundation, as Caitlin mentioned. The Walton Family Foundation is a family-led foundation that tackles tough social and environmental problems with urgency and a long-term approach to create access to opportunity for people and communities. And we work in our home region in Northwest Arkansas, on education issues, and then we have an environment program, which is where my work sits. Our environment program is focused on protecting ocean and water resources in the face of climate change. And one common thread across all of our programs is the relationship between food production, climate resilience, conservation, and livelihoods. And we have a shared recognition that when we work with nature, not only do we get outcomes that are better for the planet, but we get more productive and resilient systems that also support human needs. And this is true whether it's our work in freshwater and terrestrial ag or our work on fisheries and oceans. The thing is that food is and will continue to be this Gordian knot that we have to untie as the planet warms and population grows. And we know that food production on land is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and a leading driver of habitat loss. And food production in the ocean can be one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss as well. And yet we don't have options to stop producing food, but we do have pathways to do it better. And for many initiatives, this means turning to regenerative agriculture or agroecology or other practices that really focus on investing in the system to support long-term productivity of the land and the people who work it. Blue foods, which is wild and farmed plants and animals from water, are really only beginning to get their due as part of the food system, despite their importance globally. When you look at the facts, seafood is just impossible to ignore in the global food system. It's 15% of global animal protein consumption. It's more than 20% of daily protein intake for almost half of the planet. And this doesn't even account for the importance of micronutrients, its role in the global economy as the most traded food commodity, or the disproportionate reliance on seafood by some of the most marginalized communities on the planet. And yet the oceans are chronically underinvested, and fisheries are an even tinier sliver of overall ocean investments. So we chose to work with Three Keel to help build bridges between our land and our food systems, to help us better communicate across sectors around our shared problems, as well as our shared goals, so that we can increase attention on the food system overall and ensure that fisheries emerge as an important part of that solution. And so with that, I'll pass it on to Caitlin and the Three Keel team to share what we learned from this exercise. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Fantastic. I think you've covered these two slides, so we'll just to reiterate, as Teresa alluded to there, one of the reasons that we're looking to sustainable agriculture is because it tends to receive far greater focus in discussions that are around sustainable food systems. And when we look at some of the terms that are used there and the concepts behind them, we find that there are quite strong parallels that can be drawn to fisheries, which has the potential to bring greater attention and focus to fisheries as part of a sustainable food system discussion. So I will pass now to my, I will continue. So just starting with a primer, as we're a mixed audience today, if you go to the next slide, Olivia, we'll give you a quick primer on some of the key terms that are being used in sustainable agriculture and the concepts behind them that are bringing visibility to sustainable agricultural practice. So on the next slide, you can see that there is the starting point of our research really was to identify and collate the spectrum of terms and concepts that come up when we're talking about sustainable agriculture. And there's a whole range from things like organic to rewilding, subsistence farming, nature-based solutions. And then crucially, what we did is we looked at the detail behind what those terms refer to, the concepts that sit behind them, the types of management systems they're referring to, and practices and intended aims and outcomes of these, the systems described by these terms. So just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, we're going to zoom in on two, which are regenerative agriculture and agroecology. So the first important point to make is that with many of these terms, there isn't actually one single agreed definition, but there are usually common tenets wherever the terms are being used. So for example, with regenerative agriculture, it can be applied to various contexts, and farm types, farm sizes, crop types, but typically soil health and regeneration is usually a key central priority for systems described by regenerative agriculture, as is diversity of production and reduction of synthetic inputs. So it encourages practices like cover crops, rotations, and integration of livestock into the farming systems. And then there's a second example where we're talking about agroecology. It's also about lower input production systems, but there's usually a stronger focus on food sovereignty and particularly on the rights of producers and producer-led practice. So I guess the key takeaway is that between the terms, there are some differences in what they emphasize or focus on, and sometimes in the practices that they include. But we do find that there are shared common objectives and intended outcomes of sustainable agricultural systems. And now I'll pass to my colleague Flo, who will talk about the extent to which some of these terms and concepts are already being applied to the fisheries and marine system context, and then look in more depth at where there's further commonalities and parallels that we can draw to bring greater attention to the role of fisheries and sustainable food systems. So Flo, I'll pass to you.
Hi all, I'm Flo. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar today. As Caitlin mentioned, I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail behind our research and explore some of the conceptual parallels we identified between sustainable fisheries and sustainable agriculture. But just to start with, we carried out some initial research to understand if there's examples of where these agricultural terms and concepts that we identified are currently being used in a marine or a fisheries context. We found that there are some examples of where these terms and concepts have been applied. So, for example, the Food and Agriculture Organization have done some work on extending the definition of agroecology to apply to fisheries. Elsewhere, there's examples from IUCN and the Future Food Institute of applying regenerative to oceans and to the blue economy. And there's an example here from SCAR, but that's representative of wider academic research, exploring how we can use marine nature-based solutions to address aquatic biodiversity loss, with nature-based solutions typically being something that originally developed for terrestrial ecosystem contexts. However, we did find that many sources use these terms quite lightly, or they would apply more broadly to a blue economy context or an oceans context rather than specifically to fisheries. We also found that many of the sources identified a gap or an opportunity for greater application of some of these terms, and that gave us impetus to explore this a little bit further. So while yes, the overall picture is of, stay on that same slide, Libya. Yeah, Tar. So while the overall picture is to have, is that there is a relatively limited application of terms that are typically associated with sustainable agriculture to fisheries, we felt that this was reflective of how fisheries and agriculture are often thought of quite separately, with limited consideration of any shared objectives or of how they might work together towards a broader common goal of a sustainable food system. Throughout the next sections, we're going to unpack the language used to describe sustainable agriculture in a little bit more detail. And we're going to share a number of key principles and objectives where some strong parallels can be drawn. And the hope is that that will broker a greater understanding between sustainable fisheries and agricultural practitioners, particularly for those who might not specifically be fisheries experts, but enable that shared understanding to bring a greater visibility to what is working well in sustainable fisheries and how that can contribute to this broader question of delivering a sustainable food system. There's one thing to caveat before we start, and that's not that we're necessarily suggesting that fisheries should adopt common agricultural jargon, but actually we should explore how unpacking some of the principles that underpin these terms, as Caitlin unpacked in a little bit more detail earlier, how they can demonstrate sort of useful areas of alignment and similarity between each system. As we start, we do want to acknowledge that there are obviously some fundamental differences between agriculture and fishing systems. So the parallels that we have identified and that we'll talk through in this webinar will, of course, operate in very different contexts. We're not looking to precisely translate agriculture to fisheries or vice versa, but actually just highlighting where those areas of commonality can be useful and productive. So we've identified here 3 fundamental differences, which we think are important to acknowledge at the start. So first off, the difference between sort of cultivation and wild capture. In agriculture, we are often talking about the cultivation of crops or the rearing of livestock, so activities associated with rearing and raising. Whereas in fisheries, we talk a lot about the wild capture of species, so activities that might be more akin to seeking and hunting. Agricultural systems have very clear boundaries and they operate in quite static areas. So, for example, a fenced field. That means that activities implemented on that farm might have a more direct impact and often at local scales, so either on farm or in the direct surrounding landscape. In contrast, fisheries are clearly much more diffuse, and they operate across wide-ranging boundaries, and fish themselves are mobile, especially in the deep seas. That means that management decisions might have impact across much broader spatial scales, and they might be beyond the direct control of individual fisherfolk. The second difference is linked to the third, which is differences in ownership between the 2 systems. So while there are challenges of tenure rights and land access in agriculture, typically land is owned or leased by farmers, and the products grown on that land are typically a private resource. By comparison, the mobility of fish creates some challenges for ownership and competition between fisherfolk. Fish are not bounded within fish areas that can create challenges, for example, when fish migrate into new management areas or when negotiating fish quotas. And that's something that's increasingly a challenge as we see new fish migration patterns as a result of climate change. So yeah, as I reiterate, we're not necessarily looking to precisely translate agricultural systems to fisheries or vice versa, but rather highlighting some of those high-level and conceptual parallels that can be useful to create a better dialogue between the 2 systems. Next slide. Yeah, so here we're going to actually take a look at what some of those parallels look like and what that means in practice. Next slide. So to start with, and at the sort of highest level, we found that sustainable fisheries and sustainable agriculture share similar overall objectives and principles of a resilient food system. And we identified 4 key objectives here. The first is enhancing the ecosystem services, which often underpin productivity. So we find that both sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries seek to create a self-regulating and a self-replenishing system that ultimately reduces the human effort or input required to maintain production. Second is that we see both sustainable fisheries and sustainable agricultural systems include management decisions that span and plan across multiple years. So we find that production in these systems, when they're sustainable, will respond to ecological ebbs and flows across multi-year cycles, and that management decisions are made to support those natural fluctuations. So, for example, we might see periods of higher production or higher catch interspersed with rest periods to enable for recovery of fields or fish stocks. The third is a focus on long-term productivity above short-term profit. So sustainability in both systems adopts a long-term output for production, which is very closely linked to principle 1 and 2, where we see that enhancing ecosystem services and making management decisions that support resilience buffers against external pressures and short-term change. So we're looking at the long-term productivity of the system over any kind of short-term productivity or profit or catch volume. And finally, and crucially, a sustainable system in agriculture and in fisheries can't avoid sustainable livelihoods and must prioritise resilient livelihoods in the form of food security, stable income, but also for adequate support and incentives to reward practitioners when they are transitioning to sustainable practice. Next slide. So we are going to look into a little bit more detail at a more granular level. So not only do we see parallels at the overall objectives between a sort of shared sustainable food system, but we also found that sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries share similar outcomes that sort of work towards those objectives. These are a little bit more context specific, but we do still see clear parallels between each of the systems. We've identified 6 outcomes in particular, and I'll talk through each of those in turn. So the first is a focus on substrate health. So for agriculture, that is soils, and for fisheries, that is the seabed, and promoting the health of that underlying substrate to underpin the rest of the productive system. In both systems, that substrate is a living habitat, home to soil biodiversity, marine microorganisms, varied habitats, and nursery grounds, without which we can't support resilient and long-term production. The second outcome is around resilient yields and stocks. So we find that both sustainable fisheries and sustainable agriculture intend to promote resilient production. This means the ability to maintain a consistent production volume over time, including in response to external pressures such as a warming climate, with implications for livelihoods and income and local food security as well. The second outcome is very closely linked to the third, which is market access and income. So we see that both sustainable agriculture and fisheries promote market access and income as a central tenet of sustainability. So that not only means resilience in production, as per the second outcome, but also promoting access to market for diverse and sustainable products that maybe don't always fit under conventional market demand. So things like the diversification of fish species, which can be really important for avoiding overfishing, but needing to be able to access a market to sell those products is critically important. The fourth outcome is biodiversity and ecosystem services. This can in both systems be seen as an end in itself, so creating a productive system which has a positive impact on the wider ecosystem rather than something that's overly extractive. But also, and more fundamentally, biodiversity is a critical means to support resilient production in both sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries. So we see that both systems will take actions that promote ecosystem services for long-term production. So maybe that's to enable fish stocks to replenish or soil nutrient replenishment. The fifth outcome is carbon reduction and carbon removals. This is something which obviously receives a lot of attention in agriculture, but also applies very closely to sustainable fisheries. We might see this at a kind of surface and quite basic level, perhaps an example of both sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries seeking to reduce emissions, perhaps in fuel use in tractors or fishing vessels. But more fundamentally, both agriculture and fisheries have the potential to contribute to carbon removals. Both the seabed and the soil are critical global carbon sinks, and both can be better managed to contribute to carbon sequestration and storage. And then the final outcome that we explored was system diversity. So that's both crop and animal diversity. Both sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries promote diversity as a central tenet of sustainability, with links to many of the other principles, such as resilient yields, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and substrate health. As we spoke about earlier, we know that diversifying catch species in fisheries can reduce the risk of overexploitation, and also in agriculture, the diversification of crop cycles can avoid depletion of soil nutrients and contribute to longer-term resilient production. So that's quite a lot that we've spoken about so far. And in the next slide, there's a diagram which we've included in the report that ties this all together sort of more illustratively. It highlights the 3 areas of commonality where we found that parallels can be drawn. So that's at the top level in the overall objectives that contribute to a sustainable food system. At the second level, in the specific outcomes that sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries seek to achieve. But we also find that there are conceptual parallels that can be drawn at the practice level in each type of system. Next slide. So now, oh, sorry, Olivia, the previous one, you were right. So now we're going to zoom into some examples of what some of those practice level parallels might look like. To caveat, the kind of more granular we get in the analysis, the more context specific things become. And just a reminder that we do intend this to be sort of conceptual and to aid understanding rather than to be necessarily specific and like for like parallels. We also only use these as examples, so the practices that we present aren't necessarily the only way to achieve an outcome or the only outcome that a practice could deliver. But one in which to start is, thanks Olivia, some of the conceptual similarities that both sustainable and agriculture and sustainable fisheries might use to achieve the outcome of substrate health. We mentioned this earlier as a critical part of a sustainable agriculture and a sustainable fishery system, as the substrate in both systems underpins many of the fundamentals of productivity. But there are also similarities in the practices that seek to maintain that substrate health. So in agriculture, we often see minimum tillage used to reduce soil disturbance, to maintain plant root structures, and to reduce erosion and also to avoid carbon. This is very similar conceptually to fisheries, where reduced bottom trawling can support reduced seafloor habitat damage, protect rooted species, protect the overall substrate, and again, avoid carbon emissions. We also explored how there are similarities in the practices used to achieve biodiversity and ecosystem service outcomes, which, as we spoke about earlier, also often underpin productivity of the whole system. In the case of agriculture, a good example of this is management that maintains habitat areas in and around farms. So we might see that farmers look to maintain or restore hedgerows and wildflowers in order to promote habitat for pollinating species or for predators of livestock pests, and that in turn can reduce the need for artificial pesticide use, reduce the cost of inputs, and boost crop production. Similarly, in fisheries, we see fisherfolk looking to maintain and restore marine ecosystems to support productivity. So, for example, the protection and restoration of mangroves or kelp forests can support nursery habitat for fish and in turn boost fish stocks and reduce catch effort. And finally, we see that there's similarities in the practices used to achieve resilient yield and stock outcomes. One way of achieving this in agriculture is through rotational cropping systems, where farmers often use a fallow period to allow fields to recover and then rotate between different crop types, which maybe use or contribute different soil nutrients to maintain soil health across the whole farm and throughout the productive cycle. Similarly, in fisheries, we find that fisherfolk implement rest periods after fishing periods that allow fish stock to recover, that allow larvae to be reproduced, and that contribute to the maintenance of that stock in the longer term. Thanks very much for listening to some of the detail behind our analysis. I'm now going to hand back to Caitlin to talk through what this all means and what you can take away from this webinar in your own work.
Thanks, Flo. So if you go to the next slide. So we've spoken in quite a lot of detail, and we recognise there's conceptually some quite complex ideas here, but we do think there's real value in recognising what some of these parallels and commonalities are between sustainable fisheries and agriculture. And as we said at the top, it may be that there isn't, the parallels aren't one-to-one, but that we do think there are strong commonalities which which can be beneficial to refer to bring that additional focus to fisheries when we're in talking about sustainable food systems conversations. So essentially, what does it boil down to? What have we told you? So despite some of those fundamental differences in the systems, there are strong parallels and commonalities. There are also often shared objectives and shared outcomes, as Flo talked through. And there are even some conceptual similarities between practices. So we see that there's potential for much better understanding of the commonalities between the two systems, and that adopting some of that shared language and identifying where those concepts can be applied across both systems can help to lead to more joined up work between agriculture and fishery stakeholders towards the overall joint objective, which is a sustainable food system, which is going to require work across both terrestrial agricultural systems and marine fishery systems. So I will hand to Teresa to perhaps sum up the key takeaways from this and suggestions about how you can take the learnings forward in your own work, some of the practical applications of what we've gone through. Teresa.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. I think this work was really helpful on our end to understand how to build some of those bridges between the terrestrial food systems community and folks focused on ocean food production. And I think this is important language and translation, not because we want to, as we said earlier, change how we talk about fisheries, but to really understand our shared purpose. And so what we are seeking to do at the Walton Family Foundation with a constellation of other donors, both on the terrestrial food side and on the ocean food side, is to figure out how we better introduce blue foods and fisheries into food systems conversations where they're traditionally excluded, by bringing fishers in as voices alongside of farmers. And when we talk about how we achieve global food system sustainability to make blue foods and fisheries more than just a passing comment of eat more fish, it's good for you and it's lower carbon, but actually really unpacking what that looks like and what we would need to do to achieve those goals around sustainable fisheries, sustainable oceans, and sustainable food systems. And so what we are asking people to do is, as we take this work forward, is look at where we can include blue foods and fisheries producers, where we need to integrate blue foods into the conversation, and how we seek to understand where we have common purpose, common goals, and common approaches that we should share, and lessons learned that we can share across the different sectors. And so with that, I think we're opening for questions now. Is that correct?
Yeah, we'll just make a couple of final points and then we'll move to questions.
Okay, great.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, so we wanted to, before we move to the Q&A, just make the point that 3Kill works on food systems broadly, and increasingly we're working around marine and fisheries systems, and we see the sector as underserved in various ways, some of which we've just explored through this work. So we'd be really keen to keep the conversation going with you. So please do take a look at the report. Again, the QR code's there and the URL is in the chat. And if you want to get in touch with us, Flo and my details are there. Please do send us an email if you want to discuss any of this more, or are thinking about a piece of work that relates to along these lines. But for now, I think we can move to the Q&A. So Emily is going to kick us off with some of the questions that have been coming in as we've been talking. Emily, thank you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, Flo and Teresa. And thank you very much for your questions. We'll come on to those momentarily, but just to say, I'm Emily Scott. I'm a principal consultant at 3Kill, and I also work in the agriculture and landscapes business unit with Caitlin and Florence, and I've worked alongside them and the Walton Family Foundation team to publish this report. And so we've had some great questions and some really interesting thoughts, and we definitely welcome anything that you want to contribute to the conversation. I mean, as Caitlin and Flo have already outlined, a lot of the content they've discussed today is quite conceptual, and so we'd be really interested in feedback from those who are actively working in the sector, whether this feels like a useful tool in breaking down some of the sort of barriers between shared concepts in fisheries and in agriculture as well. I am going to kick off with a question that we've had, a couple of questions that we've had around developing a definition for regenerative fisheries. So as part of this work, did we develop a definition for regenerative fisheries? Was that something that we kind of conceived of as part of this work? And an additional question, are we suggesting that we use the term regenerative to describe fisheries? I've sort of brought together a couple of questions in one there. So I will pass to Caitlin to start us off. And yeah, over to you, Caitlin.
Great, thanks, Emily. Yeah, this was a discussion that came up during the project process, and we did explore whether that should be part of what we look at and whether that would be a useful exercise. And what we decided was that the aim wasn't really to come up with a definition of what a regenerative fishery could look like, partly because what will be appropriate management in one context is not necessarily appropriate management in all contexts. So similarly to agriculture, where we use regenerative, it's not that there's one set definition of what regenerative means, but it's more importantly, it's about the outcomes that are the aim of the management system and some of the principles behind some of the management practices that are used. And so we were focusing really at that level of identifying what those principles, management systems, objectives, outcomes were, and particularly in our case, looking at where there was potential for there to be parallels drawn with regenerative in a terrestrial agricultural context as well. And similarly, I think the key point to make is that in all of this, we're not really looking to introduce more jargon or buzzwords across more systems. That's really not the intention. The intention is to bring more awareness to the underlying principles within that those terms refer to and relate to, and to unpack where those principles are shared and where there can be sort of common and shared understanding of what the term regenerative refers to in both a terrestrial and a fisheries context. So in short, we didn't focus on coming up with a definition for a regenerative fishery, but we looked at identifying the kinds of principles and practices that are out there that may have links to what regenerative is used to refer to in terrestrial systems. Is that a fair assessment? Is there anything that anyone would add, Flo or Teresa? Happy to move on.
No, that sounds good. The next question I'm going to touch on, we have been asked maybe 3 or 4 times now, and I think it's a really obvious question to ask, which is why didn't we focus on aquaculture? Why is the scope of the project really around sort of wild catch fisheries? And also someone who's very interestingly asked whether including aquaculture makes the conversation more simple or more complex. And I think one of the things that we acknowledged at the beginning of the project is that initially there are more obvious parallels between aquaculture and farming, but we decided to move away from that for reasons that I'm going to pass over to the panel. I think, Teresa, you're happy to pick up on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I think there's no doubt that aquaculture and mariculture are going to be critical parts of our food system and should be given more attention as we talk about sustainable food production, both in terms of the impacts that they have and also the benefits that we get from aquaculture. To reiterate what Emily said, I think when you reflect back on that slide that we showed earlier that showed the differences between agriculture and fisheries, aquaculture does have a lot more similarities. I think the mental leap towards understanding where aquaculture can be regenerative is a more natural line of thinking for people. We decided to focus on fisheries because I think it is a bigger challenge sometimes for people to understand how fisheries can be regenerative. It's often seen as an extractive industry, but we have seen throughout the millennia when fisheries are managed well, when we think about sustainable production and the health of the ecosystem, fisheries are quite regenerative and in fact rely on regeneration in order to remain profitable and remain productive. And so that we wanted to focus on that different mental model around how we talk about fisheries. But I think the comments about the role of aquaculture are absolutely correct. I would actually also recommend people look to the World Fish Center, who's done a lot of work on the role of aquaculture as part of a regenerative food system. They've published some research recently that focuses on that and have a lot of expertise. So we felt like the fisheries work was really kind of an untapped exercise in thinking about shared principles, shared outcomes, and shared practices. And if the 3Keel team has anything else to add, please jump in.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you very much. I am going to move on to a question around socializing this piece of work in agricultural spaces, and whether we have any suggestions for engagement for fishing stakeholders who would like to continue this conversation. So I think that's a really interesting point to discuss with the panel. You know, to what extent could this work be socialized in agricultural spaces, and is there any current plans to send this out a little bit more broadly? I guess I could pass to either Caitlin or Teresa or Flo, in fact.
Yeah, great. I can start with some thoughts. Yeah, it's a really great question, and obviously part of the a big part of the objective with this work was thinking about how we can broaden that shared understanding and get the stakeholders working in both spheres, talking with each other and understanding each other. So that is a key intention with this piece of work. And this webinar being one way that we're doing that. I think we've got quite a mixed audience today. So hopefully there are takeaways that have been useful from people both from the fisheries and marine side of things and more on the terrestrial agriculture side of things. I think one of the key things, or thinking about practically how you can take away what you've heard today and put it into action, I think our hope is that some of the examples that we've drawn here and some of the language that we've drawn attention to could be useful for you in whatever sort of mode you're working in, to build into messaging, even if it's as simple as drawing a conceptual parallel if you're talking with someone who isn't working directly in fisheries or marine systems, talking about the practice that goes on in marine fisheries systems, and making that conceptual link to something that might be a bit closer to home for somebody who works primarily on terrestrial agriculture. So the one of the examples that Flo went through was about the conceptual link between bottom trawling and reduced tillage. I think is quite a strong conceptual parallel that has potential to kind of bridge that gap that there can be in understanding between people working in the two systems. So I guess that's one practical application that I would hope that you could take from this work and some of the things we've pointed out in the examples we've had today. But I'm really curious to hear if Flo or Teresa, if you have additional suggestions.
I will just add, and looking at the participant list, I see a lot of our partners, both on the terrestrial ag or food system side, as well as people that we're working with at the foundation to build in blue foods into broader food system conversations. I mean, I think the challenge of breaking out of silos is always that we each have our own language and jargon and communities. And part of the work in this is really understanding how to use language that's more translational across wider audiences. I think one of the reasons that I was really excited about this work is that focus on principles and outcomes, because I think that's really where we have the shared shared goals and the opportunities to learn from each other and work together and translate across the land sea barriers. So if you work on agriculture or terrestrial food systems, my ask to you is perhaps to think about where you might bring in a Blue Foods, Fisheries, Aquaculture colleague into conversations. If you work on the oceans and marine side, how do you go and seek out new partners and learn to meet the terrestrial foods community where they are in terms of language, understanding, and really try to break through some of the barriers that have prevented engagement in the past. And so I think it's work to be done on both sides. I will say I feel like there is an opening right now that we're seeing on incorporation of Blue Foods, Fisheries, and Aquaculture into broader food systems conversations. For the first time at COP28, I think, the statement on food systems included the role of fishers and aquaculture producers as important to our global food systems. And I think we'll see that momentum coming and continuing to grow. And so lean into that, make space, and also reach out across your normal community or your typical communities that you're meeting with to try to bring these messages in.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I should just add at this point, a big oversight on my part is that I have failed to say when I introduced myself that behind the scenes, we also have input from Teresa's colleague, Nick Hellman, who is Environment Program Support Associate at the Walton Family Foundation, and Julian Engel, who's a senior analyst at Three Keel and works a lot in fisheries. So I just want to say thank you to Nick and Julian, who are also reviewing questions and providing some responses behind the scenes. So I will refer to support that Julian and Nick are giving us shortly, but I just wanted to move on to the next question, which is a really interesting point around parallels between crops grown for animal feed versus crops grown directly for human consumption in an agricultural context, and also catch for human feed versus catch directly for humans, for human consumption, and wondering whether this was an area that came up in research. So I will put that one to the panel. I think, Flo, you said you might be happy to consider that. So was that something that you saw in the research that you undertook? Did it come up in discussion?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting parallel to draw. And I think what I'd say is that a lot of the sort of intention of the research was exactly to address those kind of shared challenges, which do have very similar parallels in agriculture and fishery systems. I think our research was slightly more focused on the sort of solution side of things rather than understanding in a lot of detail what the shared challenges are. But I think the point between the balance of human consumption of meat, protein, versus using that for feed is something that we see really critically coming up in agricultural conversations. And if we can communicate those kind of challenges and look at how some of the solutions behind those challenges might also be shared, then that's a really critical example of how we can start to enhance this visibility and create a bit more continuity and discussion between the two. I will just check if Caitlin and Teresa have got anything specific to add on that question as well.
The only thing I was going to mention is an example that came up as we were doing this work, which was recognizing that, related to this point, but slightly tangential, but recognizing that there is quite a direct link between sustainable agricultural production, specifically livestock production, and fisheries, in that in some cases fisheries are used, are part of the ingredients within livestock feed. And so we thought that was a really interesting example where that illustrates just how closely these systems are linked and how much they need to work together towards the common goal of a sustainable food system, and that they can't be kept siloed and just addressed entirely separately. There are those like really tangible links and connections between the two. So that was the only example that I was going to add to that. Anything you'd say, Teresa?
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I think we did not focus on the end use of any products. And clearly there's a lot of nuance here, even within a capture fishery for direct human consumption, right? How you would look at a regenerative production for a tuna fishery would be very different than how you'd look at regenerative fishing for a shrimp fishery. And I think the same would apply to forage fish versus a fishery direct for human consumption. And I think the other piece of that is, again, going back to the practices are equally as applicable to soy for animal fodder as it is to, vegetables, just like the practices are equally applicable to forage fish and small pelagics for reduction as they are for direct consumption. And those decisions around how we eat and what we eat at the end of the chain sit more in the political and economic frame than I think we're looking at today. But I do think they are important questions. And we did not explore, what the parallels to something like regenerative grazing looks like in fisheries. It was really about the farming practices and the fishing practices rather than other types of livestock management. So that did not come up in our research.
Thank you, Teresa. We've had so many interesting, not just questions, but perspectives in the chat, and really grateful for those, because I think they really help us to kind of expand on the work that we've already done and understand where other stakeholders are interested in this work. I just wanted to highlight something that one of the attendees has said around the application of the term fallow being particularly interesting. So in fisheries, the more usual term might be closure, which has negative connotations, whereas the word fallow invokes stewardship. And I think the point that's being made here is around the sort of positive and negative connotations with certain types of language. So potentially negative connotations for certain terminology in fisheries, whereas more positive stewardship, kind of caring connotations in agriculture. Which I think is a really interesting point and speaks to a sort of broader ideas around semantics and language use supporting kind of overall sustainability goals. So that's a really interesting point to have flagged. So thank you very much to the questioner for that. I just wanted to move to something a little bit more sort of day-to-day. One of the questions we've been asked is how did we undertake this research and how did we reach these conclusions? Which stakeholders did we engage as part of this work? I think that's a really important point to speak to. So I'll just pass that on to you, Caitlin, if that's okay.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so the methodology, it was a combination of desk-based research. So looking for those terms and concepts that are out there for sustainable agriculture, seeing where they've been applied to date in fisheries, as Flo talked through towards the start of the webinar, and then some digging a bit deeper into the literature to identify where there are those principles and objectives and outcomes, and seeing where there are parallels between those. And then we supplemented that with some really useful stakeholder interviews with people working both in the marine sphere and then also more in the terrestrial food sphere, but with oversight or knowledge of the marine systems. So those yielded some really interesting insights into some of the parallels between the systems and some reflections on what we were pointing towards with our analysis of what we found in the literature. Yeah, so that we sort of brought that all together, and that led to the identifying those common themes and those areas for potential parallel.
That's great. Thank you very much, Caitlin. Anyone want to add anything to that before we move on to the next question? I think we probably have time maybe for one or two more questions before we will have to close at the end of the session. So the next question I'm going to flag, as just looking through the very interesting thoughts everyone has shared, is around considering whether progress in sustainable practices in agriculture and agriculture on one hand, fisheries on the other, can be measured with common indicators, and if so, whether with this data, with the common indicators, could help build joint communication to raise awareness generally. So I guess this question is around taking the research a step further to say we acknowledge that there is a usefulness in shared language to understand different perspectives. Could it be possible potentially to find also common indicators? I think it's a very interesting thought. I don't know who wants to take that first. Teresa, is this something that you have considered or thought of at all?
I mean, I look back to the outcomes that you all highlighted in terms of what we're seeking to achieve. I think, you know, one of the challenges when we talk about sustainable fisheries is how you would measure improvement or sustainability really varies by fisheries types and the impacts that are related to those fisheries. And I think that's a struggle that we're still trying to overcome. But I think if we focus on the outcomes of what regenerative production looks like, stable production that's responsive to changes in climate and reflective of that, the focus on long-term over short-term production, the focus on whether or not we're seeing resilience and within the ecosystem itself, I think is where we get down to those common metrics. But many of the kind of specific indicators that go into that would be different and probably very fishery specific and even region specific. I would expect similar conversations around the specific indicators being different for something like regenerative sugar versus regenerative coffee or cocoa, because the places where these farms are operating are different. And so the outcomes and how you would measure progress and what you're seeking to demonstrate would be slightly different based on those use cases or those production cases.
Great, thank you very much, Teresa. So I think we probably have time just for one very brief question, which is around any recommendations for initial stakeholders to share this work with to build greater understanding of similarities between regenerative agriculture and fisheries. So I can speak to that very, very briefly, which is that I know that this report is, as you all are aware, available on the Walton Family Foundation website, and you know, we will also be making this webinar publicly available, I think, on the 3Kill website, and the report is also available through the 3Kill website too. And we have put information out there on LinkedIn, and so I would be interested to understand if other stakeholders on this call have stakeholders in mind who they would want to share this work with, and also I throw the question out to the panel. You know, are there any initial stakeholders that they would recommend this work goes to continue developing some of these concepts?
Yeah, I can start with a suggestion, I guess, thinking from the 3Kill perspective and the types of clients that we often work with. I think there's particular potential for food companies that are working across both terrestrially produced food products and then also marine produced food products. And I'm thinking specifically about retailers that sit across both sourcing farmed goods and then goods coming from fisheries. I think there's the good potential there for joined up thinking and translating some of the terms and concepts and principles between the two to make sure that there's an overall kind of cohesive sustainable food sourcing strategy that doesn't overlook one or other system. So I think that would be my first suggestion, but there are plenty of other stakeholders out there that I think the work would be relevant to. And I think, Teresa, you mentioned some in one of your earlier questions in terms of some of the forums that it might be useful to talk about this work.
I think that brings us to time. So I just wanted to say thank you to all those who participated in the Q&A, given us lots of interesting things to think about. Caitlin, I'll pass to you to close. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, just as Emily said, thank you so much everyone for coming and contributing to the Q&A. We really hope it's been useful, and judging by the comments, it sounds like there's been some useful information here and some really useful thoughts so that it's kind of spurred on in the Q&A as well. So the recording of this will be shared, as Emily mentioned, and if you have any questions or want to discuss things beyond today, then please do get in touch. Our contact details are on the slides, and we'll be sharing that again when we post the webinar publicly. So
yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to everyone on the panel and helping support answering the Q&A. It's been fantastic. I'll end it there. Thank you.